very mean in politics, went for talks at Simla, and she completely forgot that she was Prime Minister. Must be. Because she gave away on a platter to Bhutto the 95,000 prisoners take them. She said, we are moving out of Bangladesh. We are the only people who occupied a country but did not have occupation forces. We just moved up. Very gracious, yes. And Bhutto had come with his ashes, and he said, all right, let the line of control be our dividing line. They agreed. It was a document, but it was not a treaty. That was the mistake that Indira Gandhi made. There should have been a treaty, there should have been an internationally recognized treaty. What is the result of that? 10 years peace. After that, once again, the movement starts. वो जो कल कुछ हम बोला वो आज बराबर नहीं. Whatever we said yesterday doesn't apply today. Why? Because Bhutto signed it and Bhutto is hanged. There is no democracy. Zia under Zia, things again changed. And so therefore, they started talking in terms of freeing Kashmir. How do you free Kashmir when you have not given Azad Kashmir its own Azadi? Do you support independent Kashmir? There are three alternative solutions, right? There are many, but three. Remain with India, remain with Pakistan, line of control as it is. Or the whole of Kashmir should go to Pakistan, plebiscite the whole solution. Or Kashmir should be independent. Ask Pakistan today. You could ask them in the last 50 years. Did Kashmir have a choice between joining Pakistan or remaining independent? No choice. There is no such choice. You have to join either Pakistan or India. You cannot remain independent. All these groups who are asking for independence and who will also be consulted, as Ambassador Schaefer said rightly, India should consult the Srinagar groups, yes. They are asking for complete independence. All right. That should mean that the integrity of Jammu and Kashmir in 1947 should be retained, which means that Azad Kashmir and Indian occupied Kashmir should be together as one unit. Will Pakistan agree? No. I asked, half a dozen generals had come visiting UCLA, and we had a meeting, and the Pakistani Consul General was there, and among professors, professors can talk whatever because there is no responsibility for it. So I said to these generals and Consul General, I said, don't you feel a little odd about this business of determination of self-determination and so on? You are talking about it, and if I were a Kashmiri and I were to ask you, would you give me freedom? You say no, because you have such a position. You have a position where Kashmir cannot be independent. So I said, how do I feel as a Kashmiri? Do you realize that enough Kashmiris don't know about this? Okay, I said, I have a second question for you. You have enough troubles, economic troubles of your own. Yes, he said, we have economic troubles. Why do you want Kashmir? I said, it is beautiful, but does beauty bring money? Unless you sell it in Hollywood. So I said, what are you going to do for rebuilding Kashmir? You are going to spend more money? Do you have enough money for rebuilding Pakistan? And they were a little bit surprised about my effrontery. But I said that these are straight questions. I asked Consul General, who was a friend of mine, Consul General of Pakistan. We can be friends. I said, why don't you advise them that these things don't mean anything? Look at the Indian statistics. The largest amount of per capita expenditure by the Indian government has been on Kashmir. What has it given us in back to the other Indians? Think about it. What will you get back? That was one meeting. They couldn't answer. They said, yeah, it's a human folly. But I said, generals, you are practical. Don't be foolish of this kind. Think of what will happen after you get Kashmir. So he said, yeah, that's true. But I said, after you get Kashmir, do you realize that Pakistan might be dismembered as a result? The only thing that keeps Israelis together is the Arabs. The only thing thing that keeps Pakistan together, the various components, is Kashmir. You take away Kashmir, you will crumble to pieces. I said, you and BJP have a common point. These are some of the truths. I'm telling you lightly, so just to wake you up now. You can need a cup of tea at this hour. But I said, think about it seriously. If I am a Kashmiri today, would I want to join Pakistan? I mean, what kind of a thing is it? Kashmir hasn't seen oceans and the ships. They haven't seen oceans and ships. But they do know what it is to be on a sinking boat in Dal Lake. I mean, you are co-religionist. You love Pakistan. You don't want it to sink further. And you don't want to be on that boat either. Think of it. I said, young people, you have a future. We are at a dying stage. Do you want to be a part of sinking Pakistan? So when you think of normalcy, you have to think of normal minds. One of the best ideas that came to my mind last night was, Bajpayee has a sense of humor. Bajpayee invited Musharraf to come. And he said, bring your wife also along. In the hope, I think, that Musharraf will say the same thing. And he said, your wife can visit also her relatives in Lucknow and Kanpur. What a gracious gesture. I would suggest he should ask Musharraf to go back, think and come back for talks. In the meanwhile, let his wife enjoy the Indian hospitality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Damodar. One of the good things about Professor Sardesai's speech is that if any of you were napping, know that you are awake now. Which makes the job of our next speaker a little bit more difficult here. but when I go through his credentials, you will know he's an old hand at these kind of things. Shri Dwarkanath Munshi, an eminent member of our community, has worked, let me start by, he retired as Director of Press Information Bureau of Government of India, so he has handled all these press activities. He was Editor-in-Chief and Information Advisor of the Indian and Foreign Affairs in the External Affairs Ministry. He worked as the Editor-Chief and Advisor of the Planning Commission of India, a very distinguished public career. But where I intersected with him in the early 90s was when he was then the president of All India Kashmiri Samaj, AIKS, also called AIKS, AIKS, which is the apex body of Kashmiri Pandit organizations globally, with 40 associations basically working under the apex organization of AIKS, and Mr. Munshi was the president of that. And recently, or currently, he is the chairman of the AIKS Trust. The trust was started in his time, and I think he will attest that I'm one of the charter contributors to that trust. In fact, he sent me a pretty bad note, and I'm talking about something 7 or 8 years back. Said, Vijay, you can do better than that. So I had to make a second check to get past it, because I knew that if I'm on the wrong side of Mr. Munshi, I will have a tough time in the future. But ladies and gentlemen, please give a hand to Mr. G. N. Munshi, who's come all the way from Delhi to be here and to speak to us today.
Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, Congressman, Ambassador, esteemed ladies and gentlemen here, what a formidable audience it is, and what a humble man standing before you. And what has happened to him just now is that all that he had thought of speaking was taken away by the predecessor, Professor Sardesai. Take a step further, Professor Sardesai, and say that while it would be not very difficult to bring about peace, it is extremely difficult to bring about normalcy. Now, we see that wars always end with peace, and then they again begin. But if there is normalcy, let me give you an example. Near our home here itself, it's like relations between Canada and the United States. But there's peace already very much in Cuba and the United States. But that is not a normal situation. I give you sort of crude examples, not very crude though, but we've got to think in terms of normalcy, especially when we are talking for the Kashmiri Pandit to return home. It has been so much peace after all the 4 wars that have gone between the 2 countries, India and Pakistan. And they have again and again come back to war. Therefore, there has never been any normalcy. And we should not be taken in by the word peace or tranquility or any such thing when it is a question of relations between India and Pakistan. Peace here has been so brittle and fragile that you can never trust it. And what can be then normality or normalcy? If I had time, I would take you 100 years back from the point of history that we started here of 1947 or 1989. But I would like to go with you back about 100 years more and then tell you that there was true normalcy in Kashmir, notwithstanding the same divide of Muslims and Hindus. At that time, I'm sure you would have studied history, those of you, of Kashmir. You would have seen that after so many destructions that we had at the hands of foreign invaders who were Muslims, 100 years thereafter, or 100 years from now, or I would say 150 years from now, backwards, we have evolved a certain society, irrespective of the religions that we practiced, which religion at that time was a very precious personal possession, leading to salvation in their own paths, both for Hindus and Muslims. And there was no question of that bringing into the social relationship between the 2 major communities. This aspect of our history is generally overlooked. But I guess, and I submit that you might contemplate on it and consider that this will be an important aspect in considering the ways and means of getting to normalcy. We might have peace, as I said just now, but we cannot trust that peace for a longer time than a few years, so that if we were to go back and consider ourselves rehabilitated even with the World Bank loans and buildings and all the properties restored, we might suffer the same problems and troubles that we have time and again suffered these last few years. So, what can bring about that normalcy? I don't think I have a ready-made solution for that. But what could be possible to think is that the government of India, pardon my bringing in a controversial point, could reforge and redevelop its policies towards the state of Jammu and Kashmir and not give any particular weightage to just one single community. It must be even-handed. When there you have Jammu, Ladakh, and Kashmir. Kashmir is only less than 1/3 part of the total state of Jammu and Kashmir. In economic terms, it is the same situation. The two other parts are more important in the gross income of the state than Kashmir alone. But what has happened ever since 1947 is that a very special treatment is being given to the community, and they have been pampered, and they have lost that sense of brotherly relationships with other communities which they had, of which I talked just a few minutes ago. Now, we cannot be taken, and I do my utmost about making it understood by people that we cannot trust brittle peace, but only try and work towards what I call normalcy, which can be brought about over a much longer period than you can think of peace. I would say, in the final words, peace you might get, but all we said here, and if we put it in a magician's cauldron and stir it ordinance, in a turning machine, you can bring about peace, which we have been getting every 10 years. But we cannot get that normalcy which can be trusted. And for that, there are ways of getting it, but that will take a long time to explain. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, if you have questions, please pass them on to the comments here. Let me start. We are, as you know, running behind, but we'll try to get at the very least one question each for the three speakers. Let me combine these 2-3 questions that are come, which are basically in the same vein for Ambassador Schaefer. The questions deal with essentially the visit of the Hurriyat team to Pakistan, and one speaker is basically, one in the audience is saying that his understanding was that the Indian government had objected to Mr. Gilani's inclusion, and the fact is, why would not the Hurriyat respect the wishes of the Indian government, since Mr. Gilani's position is already well known? Why did they insist on Gilani's inclusion in the team, and what implications that would convey to the Indian government?
I think much too much emphasis was given to the inclusion of Gilani on the team. What was really important was getting these leaders over to Pakistan to do what they said they wanted to do, to talk to people in the government of Pakistan, to talk to the boys with the guns, to give peace a chance. Now the idea, which I think was unfortunately held by altogether too many Indians, that the sky would fall if these 5 leaders went over to Pakistan, I think badly misguided. The idea that they would say things which would be detrimental or embarrassing to India and Indian interests was greatly overdrawn. You take the case of Lone. Lone went over there earlier for a family wedding. He said things which were not at all what the Pakistan government wanted him to say, or would have wanted him said. What he said basically was, Kashmir is a Kashmiri problem, you Pakistanis. Would you please keep your hands off? And this kind of independent thinking on the part of the Hurriyat or some has got to be, it seems to me, encouraged. Why a powerful government like the government of India should get so worked up, so scared by one Hurriyat leader who says, and his colleagues disagree with him on this, that this is a religious problem and not a political problem. They shouldn't be. The government of India should approach this situation with a feeling of confidence. They should not worry about the Hurriyats getting special recognition because it's gone over to the Pakistan side for discussions. It should be prepared, and I think it is prepared, to talk to all shades of opinion in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. The Hurriyat leaders claim to be the spokesman for the Kashmiri Muslims. They have not ever stood in elections to demonstrate that claim. Nonetheless, they should be spoken to along with others. The Pakistanis, of course, are now seeking to give them this exclusive position as the sole spokesman. But my own sense is that while they are important, they are just one group, or in their case 23 groups, of people who should be spoken with, because, as I said in my presentation, this issue is simply not one between India and Pakistan. This is one in which the Kashmiri people, Pundits, Muslims, Jammu people, Ladakhis, all have a role to play.
Let me turn to Professor Sadasai now. There's a question here which says, in the historic realm, would there still be a Kashmir issue had there been no Cold War? And I guess collateral to that is, who has really benefited from 53 years of South Asian Cold War, and where do we go from here?
I must tell you that historians don't predict things. The best thing that they can do is predict the past, rewrite history. One can't speculate. If there were no Cold War, what would have been? There was a Cold War, and therefore there was resurgence of activity in Kashmir. You cannot simply take the past and change it around for even for hypothetical thinking, not just professionals. So I can't do it. If there were no Cold War, well, would there be a Kashmir? We don't answer such questions as a historian. Now, if you ask me to answer that question as Mr. Sardesai, I will answer. And that is to say this: Kashmir would never have been a problem had it not been for the strategic location of Kashmir. Between China, Soviet Union, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. It's not only beautiful, it is strategic. And it is because of this strategic nature of the place that Western countries too were interested. Remember U2 incident from where it took place, very near. And so therefore, ownership of Kashmir or hold over Kashmir is very important. It was very important in the Cold War. Second, everybody knows that if Kashmir is independent, it cannot feed itself. There are countries in the world which say, we will feed you, but do our bidding. Let Kashmir remain as a listening post over there for China, again for Afghanistan, Russia, India, and so on. So I'm not saying that everybody is a devil, but when you are thinking strategically, about any area, then you have to think of your country's interests first. And so therefore, if I am an American, which I am, and I am thinking for America, and I didn't have to think for India, I would say that is the right thinking, because that is the strategic importance of Kashmir. So in the Cold War, if there were no Cold War, there would not have been much of a problem with Kashmir. Between 1947 and 72, no plebiscite was held, no, nothing happened. People forgot about it. United Nations even shelved the issue, saying it is no longer our issue. 72, there was a solution. Now we need to give a solution again. There is not even a Cold War now. Therefore, I think we should take guts and say, normalcy is situation before 1989. Solution is 1972.
Yeah, let me have a brief rejoinder on that one. I think the Cold War did have an influence. From the time the U.S. developed a security relationship with Pakistan in 1953, 1954, until 1972, when the U.S., along with other countries, strongly supported the Simla Accord and decided that this issue, the Kashmir issue, was one that had to be settled bilaterally between India and Pakistan. The issue then went off the U.S. radar screen and only reappeared when the insurgency broke out in the end of 1989. I don't think that the United States ever had any particular interest in Kashmir for its own sake. It supported Pakistan because Pakistan was prepared, or at least said it was prepared, to toe the Western line in the Cold War. But I think the idea, of Kashmir as a kind of base for U.S. meddling in that part of the world is much mistaken. The U-2 flight took off from Peshawar. It did not take off from any part of Kashmir.
I think we're running a little bit behind. With due apologies to everybody who passed the questions. Perhaps you can catch up with our commentators later on. We will have to end this session right now. Please give a hand to our very, very distinguished speakers. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to our renowned and knowledgeable panelists once again. By the way, audience, I don't know if I remember to mention to you earlier this morning, there will be a quiz at the end of the day. Right? Just kidding. Is everyone doing okay? You have been a wonderful audience. I do want to say that again. And now we are actually ready for our final session of the afternoon. And this one will be moderated by our young and very active doctor from Chicago, Dr. Rajiv Pandit. You actually met him earlier, so we're going to bring him back on.
Thank you again, Annie. I'm actually filling in for Professor Sardesai, who unfortunately has to leave early and asked me to moderate. I will ask the panelists at this point to come up, Ambassador Teresita Schaefer, Professor Raju Thomas, and Dr. Vijay Sazava. Ambassador Schaefer is Director of the South Asian Program with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Professor Raju Thomas teaches at Marquette University in Wisconsin, and as you know, Dr. Sazava is President of the Indo-American Kashmir Forum. This final panel is really, I think, the most important panel discussion framework for peace. This is really where the other three panels were leading towards. We've talked about historical perspective, the impact of insurgency, and restoring normalcy, defining normalcy, distinguishing normalcy from peace, and now we'll lay the foundation for that peace. I will first introduce Teresita Schaefer. She came to the Center for Strategic International Studies in August of 1998, and that was after a 30-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service. She devoted most of her career to South Asia, which was one of his, and where she was the State Department's one of the principal experts. She actually served after 1998 for 4 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, which at that time was the senior-most position in the department out in South Asia. And after that, served as U.S. Ambassador to Sri Lanka, and then as Director of the Foreign Service Institute in the mid-1990s. She has published a number of articles. She holds 2 teaching positions at Georgetown University and the American University. And she actually speaks many languages, French, Swedish, German, Italian, Hebrew, Hindi, Urdu, Bangla, and Sinhala. I'll recommend that she learn Kashmiri next. So let me welcome Ambassador Singh.
Thank you very much, Doctor. One of the great benefits of trying to make Kashmiri next is that I always insist on an assignment to the place whose language I would propose to learn. So those would be my terms. To get myself in the proper mood for this assembly, I have been reading a book by P.N. Hud. The title of it is Indira Gandhi and the Emergency, but the part that I've been reading deals with his childhood, growing up in a very syncretistic Srinagar, and it really does convey how, at least in the circles he moved in, the Pundit and Muslim communities were closely intertwined. And it conveys, as few things that I've read, the special culture that I know is so precious to all of you, and that is the reason that organizations like the Indo-American Kashmir Forum find such a ready following. So I'm delighted to be here, and I am, as most of you know, I'm seldom at a loss for words, but I'm struggling at this point because the panel that was going to deal with restoring normalcy, all 3 of the panelists said, I think quite correctly, that in order to do that, you need to work on peace. And they proceeded to talk about a lot of the very important features of working on peace. That certainly will be a long-term enterprise if and when the necessary people take it seriously. I will try to find something to add to the excellent presentations that you've already heard, and I apologize if some of this seems redundant. I'd like to start by talking about talks. As everyone knows, this is an occupational hazard of anyone who deals with Kashmir, or of anyone who has been in the diplomacy business. It's very easy to get cynical about a negotiating process because all of the jokes Professor Desai made are based on the reality that it takes a very long time. And yet, without talks, without some kind of interchange, you wouldn't have had Simla, which after all kept the issue off the front pages for 17 years. And there are many other real international accomplishments that would not have taken place. So, however frustrated one may get with the length of the process, you do need a process that does require communication. And you need to expect that on a problem as complicated and as durable as Kashmir, or as India-Pakistan relations, and they are closely intertwined but not identical problems, that the process of working towards a framework for peace is going to be riddled with crises. It will not move smoothly from one step to the next. As Dr. Pundit said, I was ambassador in Sri Lanka for 3 years, and I cringed every time the Minister of Defense said, we will have this problem solved in the next 3 months. If he says the same thing tomorrow, he's still going to be wrong. 10 years, they'd be doing well. So this is a marathon, not a sprint. Third preliminary point I'd like to make is about leadership. It takes strong leaders to make peace. This is not for the faint-hearted. That means strong leaders in India, strong leaders in Pakistan, and strong leaders among the Kashmiris, because all 3 of those groups are intimately involved in the process of building a peace in Kashmir. Now, strong leaders among the Kashmiris, what does that mean? Well, the sad reality is that there is not today an uncontested Kashmiri leadership. There isn't an uncontested Kashmiri leadership among the Kashmiri Muslims. And I don't think there is among the Kashmiri pundits either, although I'm sure there are many people in this room who could comment on that in greater detail. There certainly isn't a Kashmiri voice that can credibly claim to speak for the whole tremendous linguistic and cultural diversity of that wonderful state. So that finding those who can engage in the necessary dialogue and then deliver the goods is a very important part of the task. I've said that there are three, broadly speaking, parties to the Kashmir problem, all of which need to be engaged in finding a framework for peace. None of them is going to achieve all of its goals. That's the one thing I can say with great confidence about any solution. No one will be fully satisfied. Everyone will have to give up something. In all likelihood, all three would not be equally satisfied. That, I'm afraid, is the way of the world. But all three, however you then subdivide them, would need to be satisfied enough to be willing to live with the solution. And that is why I believe it's so important that you have a process that engages everyone. The best soundbite I have heard to describe the goal one should have is a settlement that would be peaceful, honorable, and practical for all of those three groups. I wish I could claim that statement was original with me. It's not, but it does come from a Kashmiri source. I think it's useful to consider for a moment who would win and who would lose from a peaceful settlement in Kashmir. India, the country, would unquestionably win. I fully agree with Congressman McDermott that the unresolved problems with Pakistan and this ulcer in Kashmir are standing between India and its aspirations for a bigger and more consequential role in the world. A government of India that brought about peace, however, would be taking a risk. You can say to a large extent the same thing about Pakistan. Pakistan, the country, I think, would gain hugely from resolving its problems with India and from finding a peaceful, honorable, and practical way out of the support for the Kashmiri cause, which has been such a tremendously important element in Pakistan's self-concept and in its politics from the day it was founded. And in Pakistan's case, the problems that it faces internally are enormous, and the consequent benefits of not having this external problem to deal with arguably much greater than they would be for India. I would also say, though, that the risk to the government that made peace is far greater for Pakistan than for India. And it is that for two reasons. First of all, looking internally at Pakistan, the government today faces a very significant challenge, not just to the government, but to the state, from the militant organizations which have been allowed fairly free rein in Pakistan, and which have, with relative freedom, flouted the authority of the state. The second reason that I think this is a much tougher call for a Pakistani leader than it would be for an Indian leader is that it is so very closely tied up with the whole self-concept of Pakistan. And that realistically, a settlement is likely to ask Pakistan to give up more of its dream than it is for India. That reflects the power realities on the ground, and there's only so much you can do to move away from those. Among the Kashmiris, who wins and who loses? Well, this is an interesting question. The easy part of it is the ordinary people win from peace. There's no question about that. What some people have called the guest fighters, they lose. They don't have a role anymore. They become the object of a much more consensual law and order effort. And if they've been guest fighters coming from a long distance, it's not clear what they had to go home to. The National Conference probably loses. Having been the state government in cooperation with the government of India for all of those years, they have undoubtedly developed allies and enemies and created people in the population at large who feel they have scores to settle. So it's not inherently that difficult to understand why, as my husband mentioned in the last presentation, they have been accused of taking actions which sabotage beginnings for peace. The local homegrown Muslim militant organizations, you can't really say whether they would be winners or losers. And that really depends on how the political constellation eventually shook out in a peaceful Kashmir. Some of them might very well wind up in leadership positions, others not. The pundit community, I believe, could be one of the biggest winners from peace in Pakistan. For one thing, I don't see any other way of getting significant numbers of pundits back to living in the valley, because the relationships on which the old communities rested have broken down badly. It will take time and effort to rebuild them, and rebuilding them under conditions of insurgency, I think, is close to impossible. It's also useful to think about not just who can make a settlement happen, but who can prevent one from happening. And you come back to the same three groups that I've been arguing need to be included in the search for a settlement. India can prevent a settlement from happening. Pakistan can. And a whole alphabet soup of different Kashmiris could if they want to. But the conclusion I draw from that is that you need to make each of these constituencies either a part winner or to make them unimportant. And how do you do that? Well, in case after case, where a hard-bitten conflict has turned the corner and has started moving towards a peaceful settlement, the peace process itself has reduced the ranks of the most extreme elements and has added strength and people to the moderate middle. And this is why I feel that even the task of restoring some kind of reasonable normality to life in Kashmir can't work unless you can see at the end of the rainbow, so to speak, some process that has a fighting chance of leading towards peace. I don't want to duplicate what's already been said about what the ingredients might be in a peace process, because I think that's actually been very well covered. I would like, though, to stress the importance of having some visible, practical steps be part of the process. It's not just all diplomats or constituency representatives sitting behind closed doors, talking to each other around a perfectly shaped table. There needs to be something that people can see on the outside. In January, after the last extension of the ceasefire, passports would have been one of those little visible steps. That opportunity, and I think it was an opportunity, has been missed. That particular visible sign is effectively off the table. But there will be other opportunities. What happens with Casey Punt's efforts? And incidentally, I disagree with those who argue that that process is dead or that the efforts have failed. I'm not sure that that's going to be the center of gravity of the current political efforts, but I think Mr. Punt is serious and would like to see something happening and is still trying. It may be that some of those visible practical steps you need can come out of that process. There are lots of possibilities, but there needs to be at least something that the people who engage in talks can point to when people say, why are you doing this? You're just giving away the store. Let me, in closing, talk a little bit about what all this means for the United States. A number of speakers have made it clear that this group is meeting here in its American capacity as well as its Kashmiri capacity. There have been a number of statements made about U.S. policy, some of which I strongly disagree with. At this point, I no longer work for the government, so you can take what I'm saying as reflecting 30 years of experience in the government, but also reflecting my own convictions. I do not believe that India, Pakistan, and the Kashmiris are going to be able to get to a settlement of this problem without some kind of assistance from outside. I also do not believe that the way to offer such assistance is to set yourself up as a mediator with a capital M. The government of India has made it abundantly clear that they hate that whole idea. And why turn off one of the constituencies you would like to influence in a helpful direction? The government of India, I think, has also made it reasonably clear that it's prepared to play along with quite a bit of discreet diplomacy. And that is where I see a role for the United States. Not necessarily an exclusive role, not necessarily just the United States. But the U.S. does have a very strong interest in seeing India and Pakistan resolve their problems. That cannot be done ultimately without dealing with Kashmir. The nuclear danger is one I don't need to remind you about, and the philosophical desire, the values that are represented by the phrase human rights are also a very important part of why the United States cares and should care. So I would argue that the U.S. needs to be looking for ways of moving a process forward, looking for ways of encouraging India and Pakistan to focus on the big objective of resolving their differences in a way that's peaceful, honorable, and practical. It is simply not true, however, to say that nothing can happen in the world without the U.S. blessing. Lots of things happen in the world that have no blessing at all from the United States. The United States undertakes lots of initiatives that don't necessarily succeed. I think this is unfortunate. At least some of the time it's unfortunate. But that's the way it is. So that it's, I unfortunately hear much too simple to say that the U.S. should simply tell the Pakistanis to knock it off or tell the Indians they need to get serious about peace or whatever. This is an effort at persuasion you're talking about. And you're also talking about changing habits, bad habits that have been built up over quite a number of years. Ultimately, what you're asking both of those governments to do is to be prepared to accept a partial solution and to acknowledge that they're never going to get the whole one. They need to be prepared to get on that truck, and it may not even be going to Fort Lauderdale. It may only be going to Chicago. But that still needs to look better than standing by the side of the road in Anchorage with your thumb in the air. So I offer you that as my thoughts on where we ought to be going. I've focused on the process quite deliberately because I think that getting there is much more difficult than defining precisely what there ought to look like. If you can start the process, you are well on your way to having the people who need to do so define the goal.
Thank you, Ambassador Schaefer, for highlighting the challenges, risks, and practical steps that we must take in order to develop that framework for peace. I would also like to remind everyone to write down your questions, and instead of coming up directly to the table, if we could have our volunteers stand up over there. If you could bring, they will come around, but if they miss you, you could come to them, and then they'll drop off the questions here at the end. The next speaker will be Professor Raju Thomas. Professor Thomas is a native originally from the state of Kerala in South India. He was then educated at St. Xavier's College in the University of Bombay, then went to the University of London, and then obtained his PhD in California from the University of California in Los Angeles. He's currently the professor of international studies at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He has been a visiting scholar, research fellow at many other universities around the country. He has written over 35 book chapters and 30 articles, and many books actually on India, such as The Defense of India, that was in the early 70s, Indian Security Policy, South Asian Security in the 1990s, and more recently, just last year, India's Nuclear Security and Nuclear India in the 21st Century. He's currently working on 2 books, one of which is Markets and Politics in India. He has also he's worked as a consultant with various agencies, including the U.S. Department of Defense, the Foreign Service Institute, and internationally also. So let me now welcome Professor Thomas.
I'm a little confused. Am I supposed to sing? Mic in hand. I think I was just introduced as working on a book which wasn't mentioned. It's called State Sovereignty versus Self-Determination. And I'm looking at it in a global comparative context, but much of the analysis involves drawing conclusions and lessons from what happened to Yugoslavia and also to a certain extent the Soviet Union, and comparing it to the secessionist movements among the Igbos of Biafra back in the late 1960s for a separate independent state. The first thing I should mention is that self-determination and democracy are not the same thing. There's a tendency to confuse that somehow the idea of self-determination is an extension of freedom. People have a right to secede from a state if they chose to do so. Not so, at least it contradicts with the concept of democracy. Because the concept of democracy is majority rule. The concept of self-determination is a minority rule. When the minority doesn't like the way things are and sort of trying to resolve the issues within the context of the sovereign state and the territorial integrity of the state, they opt to vote out. We want to get out of the arrangement. That's essentially how it all began in the case of Yugoslavia, with Slovenia and Croatia being allowed to secede, when there was actually no fight, when no wars going on. Then a plebiscite was held in the case of Bosnia, where 2 communities for different reasons, Serbs and Muslims and Croats, joined together to vote out of Yugoslavia. That set in motion all the conflict and bloodshed in Bosnia. And the same thing happened in Kosovo. And the case of Kosovo, for instance, is not very different from Kashmir. 90% Muslim, 10% non-Muslim. Albanians versus the Serbs as against Muslims and Hindus in Kashmir. Now, I think Mr. Schaefer mentioned the case of East Timor. I must point out, although it was provided to you as an exemplary case of freedom, of people finding their freedom, I must tell you that the case of East Timor is also encouraged from the outside. When you give hopes to people that somehow, by invoking the principle of self-determination, the international community will support it, it will set in motion so much chaos and tragedy throughout the world that it'll be difficult to contain it. In fact, this is one of the lessons we should have learned in the case of the Nigerian situation back between 67 and 70. That international committee, including the Organization for African States, decided against allowing the Igbos who are Catholics in the province of Biafra from seceding from majority Muslim Nigeria, on the argument that once you allowed this thing to happen in the case of Nigeria, where will it all end? After all, the international boundaries of Africa are drawn by colonial powers. So will not every tribe and every group want to secede? Will generate massive refugee flows, bloodshed, and inter-ethnic conflict. Now, I want to bring that up as, and the case, let me bring up the case of East Timor. What Mr. Schaefer did not mention is that once East Timor is allowed to break away from Indonesia, and East Timor is no different from Goa in India. These are in fact the colonial boundaries with colonial impact in these regions. In the case of East Timor, they were made into Catholics, Portuguese ruled East Timor, and they were all converted to Catholics. Now, what was not mentioned in the case of East Timor is that allowing East Timor to break away has brought about all kinds of secession movements in Aceh, in Ambon, in Irian Jaya, in the Moluccan Islands, and to the point where now Indonesia now faces the threat of disintegration. The threat of unraveling just as the way the Soviet Union unraveled and Yugoslavia unraveled amidst a lot of bloodshed. Now, I believe that Abdul Wahid and Vajpayee met each other in exchange of visits in January 2001. The defense minister of Indonesia and later on Abdul Wahid himself, the president of Indonesia, while he was in Delhi, supported the territorial integrity of India. He, in fact, firmly, and this is the largest Muslim state in the world, Indonesia, who firmly supported the territorial integrity of India, and he was referring actually indirectly to Kashmir. So, when I look at the conclusion and the solution to the Kashmir problem, I must start with, let me give you a sort of preview of what I'm going to be saying a little later. And that is, I believe that the sovereignty of states and the territorial integrity of states, for the time being, must be preserved. We must now go back to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, which in fact believed that the way international order is preserved is by maintaining the territorial integrity and guaranteeing the sovereignty of states. That was the way to do it. Maybe later on when the world is a better place and people can communicate and live together better, then maybe the self-determination principle can come in later on. Now, before I get into that, I want to look at three main differences that exist today regarding the Kashmir question compared to the decades past. I want to bring up three major and very critical differences. The first is the nuclear factor. This is not like the old Indo-Pakistani issue anymore. Both sides have now become nuclearized, and in fact one can say that they were both nuclear states or latent or covert nuclear states from about the late 1980s onwards. Now, there is a certain, what is happening in the case of Kashmir today is very similar to what the United States experienced in Vietnam and what the Soviet Union experienced in Afghanistan. What happens here is when two states are nuclear powers, then neither state can directly go to war against each other at the conventional level. For fear it will escalate to nuclear levels. So what happened in the case of Vietnam, for instance, is that the United States fought the proxies of the Soviet Union and China in Vietnam and was defeated by the Vietnamese forces, the North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong. So too in the case of Afghanistan, the Soviet Union got bogged down in Afghanistan fighting the guerrillas of the Mujahideen supported by the United States and China, and the Soviet Union was defeated. A very similar situation now takes place in the case of Kashmir, in the sense that there are two nuclear powers, and in fact the Pakistanis are now conducting a war of proxy in Kashmir. But there's one difference today. In the past, like let's take the Kargil situation in 1999. If a Kargil-like situation had occurred earlier before the two states were nuclearized, because it's so difficult to defend Kashmir from the Indian side, for Indian forces, the strategy and the response has been always to open up the international borders. So immediately, as in the case of the 65 war, when the Pakistanis tried to cut off the Cham sector, breaking away Kashmir from the rest of India, what the Indian forces did was to open, Lal Bahadur Shastri did then, was to open up the international frontiers and send the Indian forces headlong towards Lahore and towards Karachi. Same thing happened in 1971. When Indian forces did that, immediately it relieved the military pressure in Kashmir, which is very difficult to defend on the Indian side. Now that option is now gone. What the Pakistanis have now said is that if the Indians will open up the international frontiers and conduct a full-scale war, sending its forces hurtling towards Lahore and Karachi, what Pakistan will do is start to retaliate with nuclear weapons. It does have now IRBM capabilities, intermediate range ballistic missile capabilities, and therefore it will threaten Delhi, Bombay, and the whole arc within a range of about 1,200 miles. So that makes that particular conventional option has been taken away from India. So that's one major change that has taken place. The second is now that we are now gone beyond the two-nation theory. What we see today is something quite different in at least three different ways. The first is that what you see in Kashmir are the tactics of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And in fact, some of the warriors of the Mujahideen, the unemployed Mujahideen from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, are now employed in Kashmir. That's one major change that has taken place. The tactics and the lessons they learned there have been applied to Kashmir. The second is what we see is resemblances to the Palestinian intifada against the Israelis. Now, it's something of the uprising also one sees evident in the case of Kashmir.